Throughout history, one of the most persistent and damaging cultural myths is the belief that femininity is naturally weak, fragile, or subordinate. Origin of the myth. The roots of this myth stretch across Western philosophy, religion, and colonial history. Classical Greek thinkers portrayed rationality and strength as masculine traits, while femininity was associated with emotion, intuition, and dependence. Christian tradition later reinforced these views, casting women as morally and physically weaker. These ideologies established a binary in which masculinity represented power and femininity represented vulnerability or inferiority. Cultural impact and continuation of the myth. Today, the myth that femininity is weak persists in both subtle and overt ways. It influences hiring practices, where assertiveness is praised as leadership when expressed by men but criticized as aggression when expressed by women. It shapes expectations in relationships, where emotional care is demanded from feminine people yet devalued as soft skills. And it constrains gender expression by marking feminine behavior, especially in men, as worthy of ridicule, suspicion, or violence. Carlos Andrés Gómez captures this dynamic in Guys Club. No faggots, bitches, or pussies allowed, where he reflects on how young men are trained to fear anything coded as feminine. Gómez shows that femininity is treated as a liability, something to avoid at all costs. Boys learn to distance themselves from softness, vulnerability, or emotional expression because these traits are equated with weakness, and therefore with femininity. Gómez's personal stories make clear that misogyny doesn't only harm women, it also punishes men and boys who step outside narrow masculine norms. Thus, femininity becomes a target not because of what it is, but because patriarchy values dominance and devalues care, emotion, and interdependence. Julia Serrano adds another layer in Blind Spots on subconscious sex and gender entitlement. She argues that society is shaped by subconscious biases that privilege masculinity over femininity, creating what she calls subconscious gender entitlement. Serrano explains that femininity is often portrayed as artificial or performative, while masculinity is seen as natural or default, an assumption that dismisses feminine expression as less authentic or less valuable. Serrano's concept helps explain why feminine people, especially trans women, face heightened scrutiny. Their femininity is treated as suspect, exaggerated, or deceptive. This bias reinforces the idea that femininity is not only inferior but also socially regulated in ways masculinity is not. The perception of femininity as weak is deeply shaped by race and class. For instance, black women have historically been denied the ability to be seen as feminine due to stereotypes portraying them as inherently strong, resilient, or hypersexual. This denies them vulnerability and reinforces the idea that white femininity is the default or ideal. Latina women, similarly, may be cast as fiery or overly emotional, limiting the ways they can safely express either femininity or masculinity. Men of color also face unique pressures. Black and Latino men are often hypermasculinized in media and public policy, painted as threatening or aggressive. Any expression of femininity can be harshly punished because it contradicts the stereotypes imposed on them. In this way, the myth of weak femininity works alongside racism, reinforcing social control. Class plays a role as well. Working-class men, for example, may face stricter enforcement of masculine norms because physical strength and toughness are tied to identity and survival. Meanwhile, middle and upper-class individuals may have more cultural freedom to play with gender expression without immediate threat to their safety or livelihood. Challenging the myth today. Contemporary queer and feminist movements challenge the idea that femininity is weak by reclaiming it as a site of power, creativity, and resistance. Drag performers, femme-LGBTQ+ people, and trans women have particularly highlighted how femininity can be bold, intentional, and expressive. Feminist scholars such as Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks argue that qualities associated with femininity, empathy, emotional intelligence, relational thinking, are strengths that society systematically undervalues. Serrano's writing pushes us to recognize the structural biases that privilege masculinity, while Gomez's narrative reminds us how these biases are emotionally and socially enforced. Together, they reveal that the myth of weak femininity is not about femininity at all but about maintaining hierarchies of gender, race, sexuality, and power. Conclusion: the myth that femininity is inherently weak remains powerful in contemporary society because it reinforces broader systems of patriarchy and inequality. By tracing its origins, recognizing its influence across culture, and examining its racial and class dimensions, we can see how deeply it shapes identity and behavior. As feminist and queer theorists remind us, dismantling this myth requires challenging not only gender norms but also the power structures that uphold them. Femininity is not weak, our culture simply fears the power it holds. Serrano's writing pushes us to recognize the structural biases that privilege masculinity, while Gomez's narrative reminds us how these biases are emotionally and socially enforced. Together, they reveal that the myth of weak femininity is not about femininity at all but about maintaining hierarchies of gender, race, sexuality, and power.